the difference between the kind of human flourishing, which is democratic and spontaneous and grassroots and diverse, and the kind of culture that's very hierarchical and constrained that I see with the conservative religious groups, not just Christian, but Muslim and Hindu as well.
You have this.
I think the basis is, or one of the bases of it is, the denigration of women. I think when women are allowed to flourish, another kind of flourishing tends to be irrepressible. And when these extreme suppressions of women, like you see in some parts of Islam, and in Christianity to a degree, and in Hinduism to a degree, I think that resistance to the historical re-ascension of women is part of what turns that worship of culture and values and metaphysics into an authoritarian thing rather than a grassroots, more democratic spirited kind of flourishing of culture.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there.
I think controlling women is controlling reproduction, and controlling reproduction is like
godly.
Is like I mean, that's like step one of almost any religion. Basically to build a society. To build a society, you have to regulate reproduction, and that happens to start with women most of the time.
Not to mention it causes people to, do things that are a little unpredictable and maybe not like just go to work and obey the rules. I mean, not reproduction, but sex. It's like a kind of a thing you want to kind of keep.
Yeah.
That's something that could rival the power of rulers and their mystique and their, the way they impress people with their monumental structures and so on. That sex could create a grassroots power that would militate against the rule of hierarchs.
I think that's kind of what Wilhelm Reich's angle was.
Yes.
And he was the somatic approach to psychology.
That's actually,
he was a pioneer of that.
Really interested, and remember we were talking a little bit about Merleau-Ponty, who also really intrigues me that I don't know enough about, but I'm tracking. Now this is a very interesting, I'm reading this book right now, it's a fabulous book, and I might take some training with this woman. She works with something called bilateral body mapping, and it's a form of psychotherapy in which you close your eyes, you have a crayon in each hand, and you make, it's not imagery, but you make drawings or lines that are literally what they call the haptic or felt mirroring of like bodily symptoms, or even beyond symptoms, but maybe somatic structural stuff, sort of like Reich in that sense. And it's the work, the continuation of this whole kind of subliminal thread of somatic awareness that has really intrigued me, and it's like kind of tipping talk therapy on over. And it's anyway, but the very thing that Reich did, which was like, I mean, what they did to him too for what he said.
He must have been a threat.
Oh my God, I mean, seriously,
that was books in the United States.
They burned his books. They fucking burned his books. It's pretty hard to believe.
Yeah.
I mean, what he said was, worse than being a communist. What was worse than?
It's such a threat to so many industries.
Yes.
What he was proposing.
I think he's got a lot of potential for the future. I think one of the biggest problems with the counterculture is it almost has been like the mainstream culture versus the counterculture, Freud versus Jung. You have this kind of, rationalism versus, this worship of primordial archetypes, and that I think a lot of the New Age and in some of the right wing too, and more or less explicit ways. Whereas I think, Reich has this potential. I think there's some of that in the New Age too, and it's that aspect that I think holds some of the most potential. As just he was onto so many things that I think that are still like cutting edge right now. I'm most, for me, like I think Jung was just always fascinated with the past myths, and there's this kind of reification of those structures. Whereas in Reich, I think because he was so obsessed with like this economy of libidinal energy that he was starting to get into UFOs. He was starting to get into conspiracies and all that. And maybe he did go a little crazy because I think he was so ahead of his time that he was just starting to picture this occult economy that is underneath everything, and it kind of like drove him crazy. But I think that's where we need to go, and that's where all the new myths are happening is in the conspiracy community and in the ufology community, and a lot of it has some crazy aspects to it. But I think it is this instinctive part of humanity that is looking to like recapture that energy, and from these structures that have a kind of like occult and spiritual dimension that's being captured by all these powers. And I think that looking towards the past and towards culture, or trying to capture it in a rational liberal structure, I think we're kind of in this circle of reactionary and progressivism politics, and we need something that I almost feel like Reich is the kind of dialectical way out of this kind of deadlock we have of the liberal and conservative, of the backwards looking, and then there's the linear progress of the forward looking of the liberalism.
Well, it makes me wonder if we can have some like proposed reading. Like I would be interested in reading Reich, and as I said, Merleau-Ponty. I'm really interested in his later work. I don't know how anybody else feels about that, but
that sounds great. I was going to back to the talking about the control of women in society, and that topic a little bit. Well, first I'd like to say also, I think as much of a like rationalist and literalist that Freud was, I think he did have a lot of like really interesting ideas that have been totally obfuscated by his.
So did Jung. I'm not saying that they're. I'm just.
But he did like tap into some of those things, like the idea of cyclical time, or like a kind of a space outside of, or something outside of linear time, that healing can take place in. But yeah, back to that. What we were talking about with women. I don't know if any of you have read Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea series.
I did, but like when I was
so
like, much of it when I was a kid.
Excellent fantasy series. It's about wizards and magic. She started writing it, I think, in the 60s, and then the last of the series was published, I think, in the 90s. But
I haven't read the last about.
It's so good.
Yeah, I've heard this.
It's definitely worth a reread. But one aspect in that series is it's very like this very male-dominated world of magic, and only the high learning of magic is dominated by men, and only men can become wizards. There's village witches, and they do healing and midwifery and low magic,
herbalism, just like it was historically.
And there's this, it's the kind of suppression of women, and also the wizards are celibate, and there's this whole, hierarchy.
Priestly.
Very priestly, and there's this suppression of sexuality, in order to, because the belief is that sex kind of weakens your magical powers.
Well, some kind of sex does, but not all kinds of sex do.
But there's this saying in the books, "Weak is women's magic," or and so forth. But then the more you get into the series, the more they start referring to the old powers and the powers of the earth, which the wizards don't want to deal with because that's something they can't understand. Their magic has to do with language and is built on language, and they, through language symbols, they're able to create all these spells and do all this crazy, incredible magic. Some of it is just illusion, but some of it is very real and has very real effects in the world. But then as you get into the series and women start becoming a little more empowered, or at least a few women do in this world, in the story, you get a sense that that women have access to something maybe deeper and more powerful than what the men have realized. And men have access to it too, but the women haven't lost touch with it as much as the men have in this story.
In the Harry
something
Potter,
kind of analogical that
I know this is kind of considered just
like
popping in
again. Freud and Jung again.
In the Harry Potter stories, there's an emergence of that kind of earth magic or love-based magic, as opposed to the incantation magic. There's a theme like that emerges, very subtly in the later books of the Harry Potter series.
And you can
Which
definitely
got to
see
a lot of people.
Rowling's
Yes.
How much she owes to Le Guin when you
So
you read that.
you're pretty sure she read Le Guin.
It's School for Wizards, and there's a lot of themes within that.
That's intriguing.
And I first read this
she seems to have borrowed, or
Le Guin's
I had no idea.
essay. I think I read it first in a philosophy class. She unnames them. Have any of you read that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's a great essay. It's a great essay. It's very short, and it's Adam goes around naming everything and kind of putting it in its little slot with its clear verbal definition boundaries. And in the essay, she, meaning Eve, I guess, goes around and unnames everything, which I think is very cool.
Kind of undoing the work.
Le Guin was a very interesting figure.
She's one of my favorite writers right now. I'm really enjoying.
And she wrote amazing, like The Dispossessed. We've talked about this a little bit.
Yeah.
The Dispossessed is very interesting because it is this very socialistic sort of society that lives on the moon, but they kind of had to go there, and they're disconnected from Earth. And they've had all these struggles to maintain this very egalitarian sort of communal, even, I think it's maybe even described as socialist, but anyway, it's an interesting book to read in. Yeah.
The philosophy underlying her stories is, you can tell there's depth there, whereas some fiction, no matter how good the characters are in the story development, it's like
fluff.
It's it's fun, but it's like escapist or whatever. But yeah, with her, I really feel something a lot deeper, and like with Asimov as well. There's deeper well of philosophy underlying.
So I think that part of our hope is that this is a time when enough men as well as women further the desuppression of women. I think that's a key to social healing and to the avoidance of right-wing dictatorship and fascism. But I don't know exactly why, but I see that more and more.
But it's this liberation of women is rather vague, and so I think some of the failures of the counterculture were, again, as I was saying, kind of this, maybe this type of Jungianism where there is just this, celebration of feeling and liberation of new repressed others and symbols, but no real metaphysical system, and so eventually that gets reinscribed back into the dominant underlying. Well, maybe not metaphysics, but when you don't have a metaphysics, you end up just getting inscribed into the neutral values of the economic system, and so not that Reich had any kind of great. I think he had it wrong. Like he was all about orgasm and release too, and I think that was kind of part of the problem, is that no one had any way of, at least in the early days of psychoanalysis, had no constructive vision of how to direct all that libidinal energy, and so he just thought, oh yeah, freedom, orgasm, like fascism's repression, but at least with postmodernism, there's this idea like, well,
dichotomizing.
It's not just about repression, like all of our supposedly repressive structures. This is Foucault's point, are actually productive, and Wade Deleuze puts it as like, never assume that a smooth space will save us. He has all these metaphors about deterritorialization, but at the same time he's like warning, like, too quick deterritorialization is cancer, right? You have to, like, you find a spot on some kind of structured hierarchy and find a way to experiment to deterritorialize, to then try to liberate. And with sex, I think that's been one of the big key points of argumentation between our different parts of our culture that roughly correlate with right and left wing politics. Is just, we started liberating sex, but then the right's like, well, now it's just like everybody's lost, has no morals, there's no way to kind of structure this energy, and so then there's this reaction back to, we got to find the root archetypes and get back to those things at least gave us something, rooted us in something that worked in a way that structured
society. There's been a lot of burgeoning of sort of dissipative and degenerative sexuality, and there's not even a clear distinction between degenerative and regenerative forms.
Who gets to define?
Well, yeah, it's a social debate we need to have.
Is homosexuality degenerative? That's what the whole,
No, I wouldn't say that at all.
Yeah, but who gets to define that? Some people still say that.
Well, we have to have a social dialogue, and different definitions have to clash, if we're going to get to any consensus about that.
What do you think, Ryan?
I'm a prude. I don't have a lot to say about this.
Well, that's why I asked, because I think you're a prude, but I know you do have some more conservative ideas on this. So,
well, I just think that, I think that sex is ultimately a powerful psychic thing that we're not really evolved enough, if you will, to handle or to utilize in its full potential. And I think what most people consider to be sexual liberation is just degeneracy, because they don't have any higher consciousness about what they're doing. They might say that it, tell themselves it's something more, but
it seems like there are at least some clues as to where to begin to build that.
Well, and lots of
towards.
There are a lot of occult practices, in Tantra, in
the tantric
Western so-called sex magic. Clearly people have studied this and, achieved something through it. Even, like Robert Anton Wilson, if any of you have read him, he talks about sex magic, and he's just like, it's really hard to do.
Well, one of the fundamental problems, I think, is that in a still male-dominated society, sexual liberation means lots of genital orgasms for men, and it
was also clitoral orgasms for women, which was a
there was some
thing,
emphasis on that.
There's connections with Freud there too, right?
Yeah, and the whole split about what was supposed to be real.
Well, what they thought was hysteria.
Yeah.
They thought the cure to that was doctors needed to, give women sexual release so that, then they would.
I've heard
that was a big.
They would give them, stimulate their clitoris. So that's what a lot of these doctors were doing. And the doctor that invented the vibrator, he invented it because he got carpal tunnel
For a guy.
I mean, doesn't
Probably
that-
was very busy.
I'm sure he was. Hysteria is a widespread thing.
Well,
I mean, let's be honest. I mean, doesn't orgasm help all of us when we're feeling that way?
Say that again.
I mean, doesn't it help all of us when we're feeling that way? A little crazy.
Yeah.
Chill out with it.
Yeah, I think it helps, but I mean, in a way, if the denigration of women relaxes, then I think men start to admire women, and one of the things they may admire is the low latency of what the ability of women to have almost a continual wave after wave of orgasm, whereas men are pretty much shut off after one. And so then,
or at least
then
so our
men
culture
might,
says.
then men might try to emulate, through coitus reservatus and through tantric techniques, something of what they see in women, and then you have very long periods of rising ecstasy, and that I think can also be healing. I think it can be healing of past traumas. It can be healing of
Maybe a clue as to why it's suppressed.
yeah.
Well, I was going to say, because there's, nothing causes people to break the rules or be unwilling to.
How do you package and sell that?
Well, I mean, there's a big tantric industry developing that kind of commercializes tantra, but
And also,
it's
didn't
making a
Foucault
contribution. But it's
talk
kind
about
of
this in
subverted by money.
what book was it? The Clinic? No.
Birth of the Clinic,
not
History of
Birth-
Sexuality.
Well, it wasn't the History of Sexuality, of course, the first volume, which is the only one I've read. But
So, yeah, good.
anyway, he talks about how there has been this transfer of, and I can't think of the words he uses, but his idea of, the kind of nexus of an ideology that works to kind of entrain people's orientation. And he talks about how the numinous, the spiritual, has become translated, especially when that first volume was written, I think, into sexuality, so that you're in a culture that is, very industrial, westernized, modern. God isn't as important anymore, or spirituality isn't as important anymore, but what was once held to be sort of this numinous power directing people's lives, kind of a spiritual goal, heaven or whatever, becomes translated into sex. And so sex is the numinous power of so much of contemporary civilization.
And there's a grain of truth in that, even though it gets distorted. But
a grain of what kind of truth?
Well, I mean, I think human spirituality, human subjectivity, in its concrete forms, it's almost like some of the things that Dan Brown is trying to say in his famous novel. But there's
You mean the what is it called?
Da Vinci Code.
The Da Vinci Code. Oh, anyway, sorry.
Well,
It was so badly written, I couldn't stand it.
It's populist, but it got to a lot of people. And I think real concrete spirituality can come to fruition in...
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, I'm not, when you're not talking about sort of fetishizing deities and sort of constructing reified entities that you believe in, but you're talking about the actual subjective experience, the actual spirit of human beings, the almost tangible or visible or perceivable spirit of human beings. I mean, with the kind of sexuality I'm talking about, with tantric sexuality, for example, there can be amplification of life, of aliveness, or of vitality.
Well, don't they just
There can be-
say, like in like the idea of Kundalini power, for example, that it is life energy. There's no distinction.
Well, if you want to call it orgone or prana or chi, I mean, there are various names for this, but it can be amplified
force.
rather than dissipated, and it can create tremendous experiences of love for the two partners, whatever gender they may happen to be, and also senses of a kind of merging with the universe. as that ecstasy heightens.
It's
And to
a
me, that's
transcendent experience.
yes, that's to me that's root spirituality.
And
It
it's something
doesn't depend
Foucault
on
actually went to in his later work, was emphasizing self-discipline. Because, he spent his career like critiquing the way that discipline was
Discipline and
imposed
punish,
externally.
well, not just imposed externally,
but
but
internally.
I mean, one of his whole that's one of his main points was not
like
that it isn't just
panopticon.
but that it's actually something that is created through discourse. That
Yes.
it's instead of power being just this top-down thing, that it's coming from all of us,
Mm-hmm.
and then we're
Creating
creating it through our discourse. And it's not-
Unconscious self-oppression mediated through rulers.
especially with human beings, we don't just have this raw sexuality that's
Exactly.
then put into a discursive structure, but sexuality is by nature imbued with,
Written.
inscribed into
Yeah,
this
that's the word
cultural
he
order, and so
You can't really say there is the pure essence of the sexual energy that exists apart from the cultural inscription of what we encoded. And when he's
Yeah,
giving that
that's
example
true.
of the numinous the translation of numinous into sexuality, he doesn't mean that sexual energy has any essential nature, but that rather that inscription is what it is. I mean, it just that's
so
it.
in his later work he starts focusing on, looks back at the Greeks more, because that's it's a Western philosopher, but looking at their techniques of self-discipline, of I think that's where we need to go, is making a science out of energy and human energy. Tantra has is more of a philosophical movement, but I think there's, again, with these kind of post-Reichian New Age biophysics people, I think they're starting to tease out the actual science of energy. There's little correlates with the greater field of quantum biology and understanding the way that rhythms and energy are correlated, and if you can actually align phases, then more and more energy can be produced. But anyway, creating a science, having some kind of structure that we can organize society around, but not have it necessarily be just this scientific, value denatured, utilitarian technology, but to have we can build culture and
To not have
spirituality.
spiritless conditions, but
Yeah,
spirited conditions. I mean,
but a spirituality based on knowledge, on technique,
and on self-discipline. I mean, I think your emphasis on self-discipline is right on. And you could say that.
What
I
does that
call
mean?
I'll explain what I think it anyway.
Okay.
I call the part of us which is not programmed in our chromosomes, although the potential for it is, but it's not specifically programmed in our chromosomes. I call that the human phenome. And then there's the human genome, which is the chromosomal part. And
Say that again. The phenome. You say
the phenome is the culture, basically.
Take
It's
it
the
from
learned,
the
acquired
phenotype,
characteristics.
which is the,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it's the
Oh,
phenotype
yeah,
at large.
but
Or
so
the-
it's like you mean an epigenetic possibility?
Well, it's our culture. It's the totality. It's the mean pool, and its organization.
Means
It's our
genes.
culture. And
Yeah, like Dawkins.
a formula,
No,
a general
or unlike
formulation
Dawkins.
I would say to talk about discipline is
I'm
that
still-
for us to become fully human, the phenome must overcome the genome.
Well, I don't understand this,
And
and I don't understand it because I don't really know what you mean by phenome.
well, by the phenome, I mean the
The
things
means.
about us which are not coded in our chromosomes.
the
all
means
of
and the
culture.
genes, the means, the phenome, genes, the genome. Right?
That's a good way to
okay,
think about it.
but so it's an you could say it's the
do you
conscious
s-
heritage that leads to a certain potential.
And it means
How do you
that we,
separate those
And now you want to
Well, they don't separate
overcome the
completely.
genome? That sounds really.
when I mean
I-
overcome in the
complete-
German sense of Aufheben. And so you're not suppressing or rejecting your body or your sexuality or all the bodily
wait a
functions,
minute.
but you're incorporating them into a cultural construct that has
So aren't you-
collective assent, that's been proven itself and is adoptable by.
Is it-
And you know, for males, there's no better example, concrete, practical example of the phenome overcoming the genome than a male relinquishing genital orgasm for a higher purpose.
So,
You know, in other words, having sex but restricting, you know, coitus reservatus, avoiding, you know, early ejaculation, so that the full experience of whole body orgasm can unfold.
and
And
that
it's a very
is-
difficult thing for men to do, but it's a big example of self-discipline, a very practical one.
Can we go back to this concept, because I'm completely confused by it. So you're saying that there is a sort of transcendent, since you used that word auf, which I can't ever say, Aufhebung, something like that. So you're saying there is this transcendent thing that is culture. It is the
I don't know if it's transcendent, but
well,
it's,
then what
it's
the hell
not.
is- I don't know
It's
what
not.
it is.
It's not in our chromosomes. It's something
So where
we've
is it?
developed.
What is it?
Well, it's in our minds. It's a collective social product. It's a
You mean
historical
it has a life
product.
of its own
Well,
outside
we give
of
it
us?
life. We give it life, but
So,
it's
I
not.
mean, it sounds like this is like a
it's
very
not genetic.
reified sort of thing.
Well, it's observable. I mean, we have language. Probably the deepest root of the human phenome is language. Our language, our spoken
thinks
language,
it's,
is not programmed in our genes. Maybe the capacity to have language is, but a specific
well, he
language
views it
like
sort
English.
of like the
Johnson?
visual apparatus where it takes stimulus input to develop, but that it's
Innate.
present. It's innate.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. We certainly
So-
have the capacity to create a phenome that's in our chromosomes, but the actual
Well,
content
I don't know
of our
what that
phenome
means either.
is not given in our chromosomes. The way I see it.
This reminds me of.
That's why they're different cultures.
This reminds me of a lot of cultures, religions, etc., have a story where they were basically brought out of savagery, barbarity, by a message from above, and
Or somebody who
or
carries it.
just a
Or a
message.
priesthood that helped them.
Some higher agency came and gave
Shifted
these ideas
things.
to them that
Mhm.
that weren't necessarily self-evident to them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't know.
Doesn't that often also entail
The trickster.
being going from a nomadic lifestyle to a fixed?
I suppose so, but I just mean for the purposes of maybe a phenome versus a genome, and the phenome overcoming the genome. I don't know if that's just what brings to mind. I don't know if
Overcoming
there's-
by including it, but yeah, there are religious geniuses and cultural geniuses who innovate
Coyote
new
in
means
Native
and
American
systems
traditions.
of means that then maybe sweep through the population, and there's an adoption to some
Like-
degree of their
like an
of
example?
the means they created. Well, Mohammed, or Jesus,
But
or
what
Krishna,
okay, so what you're saying
Or
is
Marx.
this
or Marx.
idea
Yes, or
of
Marx.
the phenotype, which in the genetic usage, is like very. I mean, even if you took, say, an isolated individual of some species, the genotype and the phenotype are still manifest no matter what. I mean, there's a physiological mechanism for both of these things. But this idea that you're talking about the phenotype, and I mean, I've heard some similar things, but what I'm saying is that if you took somebody who was born into the phenotype of Western civilization and took them to, not that any such thing really exists, but I mean, a completely isolated Amazonian culture, that phenotype in that individual would not exist.
Or it would change. It would definitely change. I mean, I've seen, people with an Asian ancestry who are totally American.
Well,
They,
yeah.
they speak without any. They speak with an American accent.
They
Their
are
cultural-
American.
They
Pick up
are
the
American.
pheno what was it?
The
Yeah.
phenome.
The phenome of the surrounding culture.
Yeah.
Or-
And there's probably a hybridization that goes on, but still one thing
racial
they
assumption,
dominate.
I think. Even.
No, it's not racial. It's cultural. There's a definite
I mean-
phenome in Asia, and there's
But
a
you're
definite
saying it's
phenome in the U.S.
listen to this with surprise. It's like, look,
Well, some people would be
they are
surprised by
Asian,
that.
but they walk and talk
Well,
like Americans.
No, he's not saying that. He's saying an immigrant.
Yeah.
An immigrant.
Oh,
I'm talking
not
about
somebody
people who
born,
transplant.
but they're
their
not born
phenome
here.
changes.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
Yeah,
Sorry, I
I
misunderstood
saw,
you.
in-
Maybe I was all excited by
Yeah.
the idea that
I-
this was racism.
In
Sorry.
India, I saw people, the Indians, who lived there, were born there. They could tell the difference between native-born Indians and Western-born Indians just by looking at them.
I've heard this.
Yeah, there's
Posture.
a body manifestation of the phenome. Yeah, the way you hold your body unconsciously
But I've
tells a
also,
lot.
yeah.
There's something transmitted through very subconsciously.
I've even noticed that cults that I've encountered, political cults, religious cults, there's sort of a way of holding the body that kind of is an emulation of the leader of the cult that I've noticed going through the disciples of that leader. You can almost tell that this person is part of that cult. There was the LaRouche cult, and there was just a sort of a unspoken body language.
Lyndon LaRouche.
Lyndon LaRouche.
Did you hang out with these people? Is that how you?
Well, I was close to people who were in that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
And
never
then-
joined myself.
And then there was Timothy Learyites, and look at their.
Yes, I remember that.
What made you think of Larry?
Oh, I just thought suddenly all over the place there are these people wearing flowing clothes and bells and big beards and hair all over, and the wafting smell of.
I dare say their chromosomes didn't, in detail, control or determine that.
But then there's also some of the research that's being done on epigenetics now, which is
Oh,
like I
yeah.
was just before I came reading this thing about the epigenetic heritage of children whose parents were in the Holocaust, and about how their bodies basically have in their metabolism they have less cortisol. And
Wow.
and I've read some very interesting things about their because I'm interested in this, like really at this point culturally significant thing happening with the idea of trauma and epigenetics. And so they've done empirical research on this, although they were talking in the article about really they're fairly inconclusive because they still have to be replicated, a lot of them, and that they're the assessment is still very preliminary. But anyway, you find over and over again now this whole concept of epigenetics is starting to become increasingly.
And it's a Lamarckian element that's being
yeah,
admitted
it is.
now.
Yeah, it is
yeah.
exactly that.
There's several
So
new
it's
strands.
it's a feedback loop between
The
both
genome and the
phenome.
experience.
Right.
But I think the way I see the Aufheben is just this uplifting of one to the other, but learning actually this. I think a lot of the.
Or the integration of the two is what I see.
I just see that the mind is constantly trying to learn the laws of nature. Call them the laws. Maybe laws is the problem. Maybe the laws is the reason we keep repressing nature. And even though we're trying to integrate them, we keep looking at it as some kind of linear
Trying to
rational
find some
plan,
fixed rule.
some fixed rule. And so,
applicable universally, not locally.
but we know that we want a culture that can survive, that isn't just tied to the idiosyncrasies of one culture or one biological adaptation, any kind of specific localized adaptation, but something that is based on laws that are more universal. And
Universal patterns.
universal patterns. The patterns.
Universal habits
pattern
of
is a
nature.
word that I think is better.
Than
better.
the law.
Explain more about that. I don't understand that either. Sorry. like, what would it mean to have a universal law or pattern?
Well, this has always been the kind of dialogue, at least in Western philosophy.
Right,
So
yeah.
mathematics was often touted as
the
as
universe.
The language of the universe.
You know,
Right.
we notice that there are galaxies all over the place, and in those galaxies, if they're like our galaxy, we now are learning that there are planets typically around the stars.
And
But then
yet
we try
people-
to like mold our societies into these mathematical laws, and then there's detrimental effects. And so it's not. So instead of trying to make these few tautological mathematical axioms the basis for society, I think we're learning that okay, there are patterns that are trackable, mappable, and we can build our society on them, but I think we're learning that they can't be just these axiomatic systems, that they have to be based on a constant feedback with the environment to be like, well,
Yeah.
in this
is
environment,
that how you
this-
mean
this-
universal?
this law is well. When I use the word universal, I try to emphasize the concrete, and that's rather than an abstract universal, which is kind of like a law.
Okay.
A
okay.
concrete
Yes.
universal for me is all about how each thing
Or
is
like-
is an individual, but that individual can be deployed in different contexts, and so it has a certain universality to it. It meaning anything.
Wait a
Anything can be redeployed and become part of a map, but as opposed to an abstract universal where you have just a law that you apply the same way in each situation, a concrete universal would be something that you realize has utility in different situations and you can redeploy it in different situations,
And that
but you
would
have
be-
to
It's
always
like
be able to
Something
be
that's adaptable to.
you have to actually take the
So-
context into account when you're redeploying it and be like, oh well, it's going to work differently in this context.
Because like you hear like that even the laws of mathematics before the universe, or maybe even like in the initial moments of the universe when they say everything was plasma and there were no atoms or particles like the way we have now, that there was a different, even the physics and the principles of physics and the mathematical underpinnings didn't hold, and so that there is this argument that there's locality of in context, as you're saying, is like even those things that we have taken to be timelessly valid have temporal or even local.
But
In
contrast to
yes.
that, though, I think that that's
Okay.
going too far down this path that Whitehead and some other people have. And there's a popular kind of countercultural guy, Rupert Sheldrake, that says
Oh, yes,
similar
right.
things about like
Mhm.
because they're thinking in terms of laws, they want to say, oh well, laws are something that are just habits that have been accumulated, and so that they're not.
Isn't that what Hume said too?
And and also Whitehead.
Uh-huh,
Right. Yeah.
uh-huh.
So Whitehead.
Oh,
Hume-
and Peirce. Peirce said that.
Hmm.
He was one of the first to talk about the habits of nature as opposed to laws.
Right, but yeah, I think he had a little bit more of a realist take on.
Yeah,
I guess
yeah,
you
yeah,
can have
I think you're
realism
right.
and habits, but what I'm saying, instead of saying that it's a law that's evolving, and for me that has a sense of the arbitrary.
What does that mean?
Meaning that it's changing in an arbitrary way, that the laws are just that they don't have a reason, and so what?
Oh,
what,
wait a minute.
What,
So you're postulating there is a continuity?
Actually, yeah,
Okay.
I don't know why you said that, but continuity, I think, is primordial,
Because
and
it's a
that discreteness is how we actually, by modifying continuity, we attain local, territorialized
Okay.
systems,
Okay, I see.
and
That
and
was
it's
the-
not just. And I don't think of it as some linear path from some big bang where there
Cause
was
and
no
effect.
laws
Yeah.
and then laws then developed and into habit, because I think there is a universal virtual structure that's always being modulated, but not in an arbitrary way.
Like an implicit one?
I suppose you can say that. And one of the ways that I like to frame this is so following this philosopher Gilles Deleuze, he takes people like Leibniz's idea of the principle of sufficient reason. That said, well, there's the early modern philosophers, rationalists, all thought, Leibniz in particular, thought everything has a reason, and so there is this idea of continuity and of everything having to be explained and not just being a law that has some arbitrary action. Where Deleuze changes that is that it's, instead of it being a single thing, everything having a cause, a simpler reason, and having this causal structure, this deterministic, mechanistic structure, everything has reasons that are constantly being produced by, especially by subjects, by subjectivity also needs to be explained. It has explanations too. It's not just a collection of habits, like we would say. It needs to have an explanation too. Everything needs to be explained. Everything has some link and connect. But when you think in linear terms, linear time terms, you think, oh, where did it start? What was the cause? What is the reason? And so it leads you into this dialectic where you have to either have a determined, a strict, absolute, transcendental determination for something, or else it becomes arbitrary, random, or just a drift in genetics or something.
Something I like about your feedback concept is that it accommodates a view of the ontological status of the news. It accommodates of the news of what's happening.
Okay.
It's
You
not
mean the
like
media
it's not
news?
like well, I mean the news of whatever ways newness communicates itself. Instead of having a static diversity where there are these preordained provinces that for all eternity stay separate and different, it's the idea of what I call ontodynamasis, that ontology gives birth to new ontology, that old ontology gives birth to new ontology, and so there's always an ontological content to the news. Whatever patterns or laws or habits you've identified in the past are not eternal, are likely to be modified by things that are erupting all over the place, and then in some cases generalizing themselves.
Well, what I was going to mention before is like in the like systems theory or complexity theory, the idea that causality, as Newtonian causality, like the cause and effect have a proportionality, that big causes have big effects and little causes have
Not
little
under
effects.
nonlinearity. With
Well, that's
nonlinearity,
exactly where
a
I'm
small
going.
cause can cause a big
That's
effect.
exactly what I'm saying.
Oh, yeah, that's what you're getting to.
That's what
Okay.
I'm getting to.
Yeah.
That in complexity science, that is no longer the case.
Yes.
That was Newton's sort of, or I don't know but people call it Newtonian.
Right. He had a wider sense of causality, but there was after him a shift of focus, or an exclusive focus on what Aristotle called efficient causes, which is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But his equations are nonlinear, and never been solved in full closed form.
But what I'm talking about is the kind of cultural shift from that kind of, quote, Newtonian mechanistic causality, even though, yeah, I agree. I that's not, but it's just called
The
Newtonian.
disciples of thinkers are never
Yes, exactly.
It's like
true
neo-Darwinists.
to the great thinker.
Darwin
right.
sort of escaped neo-Darwinism.
Oh, God,
critiques
that's
for
the
the
worst ever.
Hegelians and and then the Marxist
Oh,
followers
God.
of the
Anyway,
20th century.
what I also want to say is, I mean, for example, that's how they're, and everybody knows what, the butterfly effect. These minute causes can have huge ramifications. But also, I kind of forgot where I was going. The idea of the arbitrary. When you mentioned it, I was trying to understand the context of how you meant arbitrary. I mean, because the issue of what's actual random, which I take is what you mean by arbitrary, is itself questioned.
Right. Well, that's what I'm
Okay.
redefining arbitrary as well. Well, in information theory, they have a concept now that randomness is just really complex information. And
Right.
So, call it chaos, but it's always just something that isn't territorialized yet. It's and so Deleuze just would often call it chaos, but he didn't mean, he had an idea of, he had the word, him Guattari called it chaosmos, to kind of have the idea that they're not separate. That
It's
chaos
not disorder, it's complex order.
It's it's infinitely complex because it can never be fully inscribed. But it's not just
order to the cosmos.
You're not just imposing order on it, and that's what's called hylomorphism, where you have this idea that order is, and they often gets associated with Aristotle, especially because you've got this order being imposed on a
Matrix.
on matter, matrix, mother, metric, instead of being, this reciprocal relationship like yin and yang
involving
between
self-organizing
and the womb.
processes.
And do you know, like, one thing I've tried to understand more clearly is Maturana and Varela's concept of structural coupling, which, do you know, I would actually like to, if you know something about it, I'd like to know more about it, but I always think of it in something like the terms that you were talking about just now, that there's all this very complex feedback loops between any discrete thing, even, but any discrete living thing, autopoietic, I think that's their word.
Autopoiesis,
Autopoietic.
Self-making.
Entity, which, I mean, they even, even a thing like a hurricane has certain self-organization. But now what was I saying again? Anyway, this idea of structural coupling is like any autopoietic thing has this incredibly complex relationship with its environment, and it's constantly feedback. So that, I remember having this discussion, like if you took and you wanted to send cat chromosomes, across the galaxy to some alien civilization where they would take the cat and try to clone it, that basically...
Tardigrades to the moon.
Yeah, tardigrades to the moon, along with lots of... so they can,
Israelis,
maybe feed on the bags of human poop that the Apollo astronauts left. There 96 bags of it, and it litters the surface of the moon.
Poop, you said?
Poop. Yeah. They have little white plastic bags littering the moon, 96 of them, that have feces, urine, and vomit in them.
Vomit too.
Yeah, vomit too. So the tardigrades could, I don't know, I guess they're
That's
vegetarians.
that's a lot of microbial life there. I don't know if it's going to last.
But
DNA. The tardigrades, if they survived, are probably in some sort of stasis, metabolic stasis.
Yeah, they're on these plates of, I read about these things that kind of held them.
I didn't read to that great of detail, but there's been like a million news stories, it seems like.
Evidently, I read something about an Israeli space probe left some tardigrades.
Yes,
they crashed on the moon.
It crashed.
And it had all kinds of biological samples, but that was one
DNA.
of them that there's a chance that it survived the crash because they're such a sturdy life form.
Do you know the tardigrade song?
I don't.
It's like, if I were a tardigrade, I'd move out from home. Why live in the shrubbery when you could have a throne? Anyway, this English guy wrote that.
That's cute.
Yeah, they could be the kings of the universe because some song goes on to say, pressure wouldn't crush, quoting the tardigrade, pressure doesn't crush me, fire won't burn. Anyway.
So, Melody, are any poems coming to mind from our discussion?
Oh, besides the song?
Besides the song. I want something we can sink our teeth into here.
You mean any poems of anybody's?
Any poem.
Oh my God. I'll have to think about that for a while. But anyway,
just curious.
It's
a good way. It's a good way to close.
We're trying to close it up, I guess.
Yeah, right. It's time. Yeah, here. I have these glasses on. I can't see out of. Okay. Yeah. Well, no, I can't think of anything.
Come on, you're supposed to have some prepared.
I have some
Give us
poetry
give
on
us
me,
some
but it's
poetic,
not
closure
related.
to
Working on
our-
some stuff, but I don't know if it's presentable at this point.
You have some stuff?
I've been working on some stuff. but-
Some
Oh,
poem?
and is
I
it
don't know.
philosophical? Does it have to be
It's-
relevant to what we were talking about?
I guess not. I mean, we can imagine the relevancies later, rationalize them.
This ties into
After
it.
the
It's all.
fact.
It's not arbitrary, right? Nothing's
We can
arbitrary.
handle
No
it in
matter,
Oh.
no matter what you
commentary.
do, it can't be arbitrary.
It's
So arbitrary is just a way of lack of imagination. So,
Okay.
right. So there's always a sufficient reason if you got the imagination.
There's always a connection whether you see it or not.
Oh, I could read you a poem, I guess, if you want. But or you want to read yours?
I don't know if I'm comfortable with that at this point.
Wait till
I'll
next
read you
time.
one.
Maybe next time.
Let's
yeah.
see.
I'll try to
I don't know
polish
what I
it up a
did
little
with
bit.
it. Oh, it's around here. Okay, I'll read you a
My
poem.
poems are all really sciencey, but I don't have any.
This has nothing to do
Handy right
though
now.
with what we talked about.
That's okay.
Is it? I have to take this off because I can't see out of them actually. I just like to pretend I do. I think it's in here. Let's see, is this it? Oh. I have another poem. I forgot about this. But this is a very it's about D.H. Lawrence partly.
Sweet. One of my favorites.
Really?
It ties. He's definitely into sex. That was one of our big.
Oh, yeah, it's not the
Topics.
part about sex, it's the part about death.
Oh, it's all the same.
Death, sex, you know.
And it's plus this is a
We're
draft.
talking about dichotomies and opposites as well. So you have
There's
poesis and
depoesis.
Depoesis.
Dispoesis. Making and unmaking or demaking.
I have all sorts of strange things.
And that's a theme in Wood Win as well.
Oh, really?
What is?
She sounds interesting.
The making and the unmaking of the world. There.
Oh, kind of like what she was
yeah.
saying with the
Unnaming.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be in here. It's not. I don't know where it is. Okay, I'll read you this one, even though it's a draft and it's not very together. All right, it's called Eclipse Moon, and it has nothing to do with anything we talked about, so we'll have to make it up how it's connected. Midnight, the moon almost gone, the empty space of the heavens echoing the light gone out like a candle blown, a wisp of loss floating up. Yet something magical taking place. I saw the crescent of last light disappear, holding me. Everything stilled and the moon floating in the sky, transforming, shedding her old skin, metamorphosing, descending into the dark, the unknown, quiet and hidden, overtaking her, relentless. The surge of blood spreading across her face, time compressing and folding her cycles of change into this powerful moment, all the moments of your perfect rhythm, so freighted they buckle and break, yet speeding on past all limits, all the cries to hold, let go. I don't know about this poem, but anyway. The butterflies, the soul's metamorphosis, like this? Can you like this? Within the coiled container of darkness, everything dissolves. We can't know the moment when everything is lost. There is no moment like this. Oh, Lawrence, is the boat of your soul like the horns of the moon's going on dilemma, the dark and endless ocean of the end, the fallen self? How do we go? Where? Row and row and row, lined up. For what? The wearing, the falling in every moment, answerless, rudderless, ruthless. In this moment of perfect lucidity, neither light nor dark, all the moments of your perfect rhythm, all rhymes recounted and released. No rhyme in time to catch you, you never there, unrhymable. But as Lawrence foretold, even as he followed Persephone down the sightless path, the moon returns from that dark and endless ocean in her arc of faith, arcane incandescence cracking the nadir of the sky's mirror. Darkness wakes the dark. A flush of rose, the whole thing starting again, a fathom separating from the before into an after, the archives of the moon unscrolling, a bright leaf emerges, the torch is passed. Well, this was obviously an eclipse poem, but the other part of it
Lawrence was referencing
D.H. Lawrence, and he, at the end of his life, he wrote two poems, one called Bavarian Gentians, and the other called The Boat of the Soul, and they're about his impending death. I think Bavarian Gentians was written 3 days before he died, and it goes, "Not every man has gentians in his house at slow, soft Michaelmas." Now I've forgotten the rest. Oops. Anyway, what he's saying is that these gentians are like torches, and he's following Persephone down into the underworld. And it's a really powerful poem. At least I think so. And The Boat of the Soul was written not long before that, but he was dying when both of them were written. He died of tuberculosis at a pretty young age, 44, I think. And so in The Boat of the Soul, he's talking about, like these, I think, Egyptian boats that were considered to hold the soul, and about how they set the,
metaphor.
like at death, they set the boat out onto like the sea of existence, or maybe even death, and the uncharted, the whatever, and but then the boat returns, and so he's like this affirmation of life's continuity.
The
And
boat came back empty of what was on it, but it came back.
Yes, and there's a waking again. Anyway, it's kind of a longish poem, but it's an interesting poem. And what I was doing is I'm staring at this eclipse moon and how everything turns dark, and it was a total eclipse, and how they turn really red to
Yes.
and anyway, and I started thinking about what Lawrence was talking about death and going down into the underworld, and then but the boat of his soul, this flush of rose, which is a quote from that book, The Boat of the Soul. But I thought that's how the moon looks too, this kind of red color at the total lunar eclipse. Anyway, that's some context for that poem.